A Tale Originals presents
A pinprick at first, a spark of blue unfurling in the black. It expanded, rippling outwards. In the bowels of the blackness, ancient machinery hummed to life. The light deepened into a sapphire blue at the center, almost blinding white outer rings. With a sharp whine echoing off the cold, unyielding stone, the light shot up. It drilled through stone and punched through the final rocky barrier into the open air. The light abruptly died in a pulse of sound that rippled outwards, sweeping through trees, bending laden boughs, stirring up loose pebbles and sand in its wake, all the while carrying a low, rhythmic series of distorted chirps. It was near inaudible even in the hush that befell the mountain for a series of heartbeats. The animals went unnaturally quiet. Only one creature in the woods had the presence of mind to investigate rather than fear this occurrence. The boy cocked his head, his eyes astounded as he tried to puzzle out the new noise and its significance. He stood and padded a few feet forward on the mulchy forest floor, his ears pricked. All at once he understood the noise and what it meant. He sat, unsure of what to do. He would have to go down and look for the noise source, yes. But what would he do once he found it? He would cross that bridge when he got there. The noise of the forest resumed as though nothing had happened. The boy shuffled around his grotto and hefted a pack. He filled it with supplies and slung it on his back. He stared at the mouth of the grotto, at the warm sunlight across his threshold. He had a feeling he'd be gone a while. He groaned in yearning. The world outside was dangerous and far too crowded. He'd rather stay here, lost in his own thoughts and dreams. But he had to know what that sound had meant. He crossed the patch of sunlight into the forest and lifted his nose to sniff the air. 1,000 scents assailed his nostrils. He picked his way towards the mountain. The warm wind stirred up strands of his straw-colored hair in the late afternoon sun. Ben scrunched up his face in concentration. He was sitting at the crest of the hill, looking down on the farms of Silvercroft. His shorts were grass-stained, as well as his socks and shoes. And there was a clump of damp dirt stuck to the back of his head, courtesy of Ash. 30 minutes earlier, he'd been chasing her down the hill, trying to get his journal back, and she'd giggled, spun, and dashed away. And when he had been about to give up and march back up the hill, she'd gathered damp soil in her hand and chucked it at him. He'd forgotten the fundamental rule. Never turn your back on Ash. She might put a worm down your shirt or a spider in your hair. Now the 6 of them were sitting on the crest, and Ash was trying to goad Juan into some complicated game she'd thought up on a whim, including arm wrestling and flicking the loser's nose. She'd asked Ben, but he was still shaking sand from his head and was a bit annoyed and red-faced. Maury looked at the scuff on his shoes, so he told Ash no. She stuck her tongue out at him and went to Juan. Ben snuck a look at Maury. She and Lise were whispering rapidly under their breath, and Lise was giggling. He wondered what they were talking about. He almost asked, but Maury would tell him it was nothing, and Lise would say he should butt out. Nico was hunched over a book, scribbling furiously, the tip of his tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth. Ben sighed and looked down. From that height, the vista of the Silvercroft farm spread before him. Usually they would be bustling with activities and the deep chugs and rumbles of tractors and farm machinery. Specks of people moving to and fro, busy with one task or the other, and spraying water everywhere. Now it was like looking at a ghost town. Most farms were emptied of man and machinery. Nothing except tall, waving grass, spindly-looking shrubs, and acres of crops were left. Lisa's parents' farm would be joining the ghost farms. They were packing up already, ready for the corporations to come to raise the earth and build malls and office buildings. The farmers dismantled machinery and moved back and forth, their arms waving and gesturing, no doubt arguing which would be sold at the auction. Ben's frown deepened. It was all moving too fast. Lise said her parents signed the contract a few days ago, and now they were already packing up to move out of town. Come summer's end, only Ben and Maury would be left in Silvercroft. That's if his dad didn't sign away the farm to the Gateway Group or one of the others. But he suspected the Gateway Group would be the one to buy the farm. They'd come round to the farm a few times with their black suits, slicked back hair, and briefcases. His dad got a look in his eyes every time they came, like he was dazed. "Urbanization," he'd told Ben when he asked why the men were here. "They are here to plant malls and arcades. You like malls and arcades, don't you, Ben?" Ben had said no. He liked the farm, his friends being around, and he liked old Mr. Stevenson's shop. His father wore a patient smile when Ben told him that. Everyone was eager to sell and leave, even Ancient Clifford, who was so old he was alive before Ben's granddad was born. He'd been the first to sell his farm and told everyone that he was traveling to the Italian countryside and buying a vineyard with a wistful look. Ben thought it sucked. Silvercroft was a small town far away from the shadows of bigger towns or cities. Hardly anyone craved for the lights of the city. They wanted a simple, quiet life, working their farms with dignity. They weren't country bumpkins. As old man Stevenson put it, they were the folks of Silvercroft. They had good heads on their shoulders. At least that was what Ben thought until the Gateway group arrived in their Mercedes, lodged themselves in Betty's bed and breakfast, and came out the following day with shiny shoes and briefcases in hand. And on their heels came other corporate representatives with their own sweet deals. Everyone suddenly developed a severe case of stars in their eyes and big dreams that led them far away from Silvercroft and her peaceful life. Ben tore out a fistful of grass and released the blades into the wind. He imagined that it was the folks of Silvercroft, uprooted and scattered. He tried to imagine going to school in a new city where he didn't know anyone. His heart lurched and his stomach tied itself into painful knots just thinking about it. Only a handful of farms were still holding out, Ben's and Morey's families included. But for how long? He'd asked his mother if they were going to sell like the others, and she'd smiled at him, reaching out to ruffle his hair. "We are Haynes, Ben. Our place is in Silvercroft. Where would we go?" She'd laughed softly. Ben would have believed her if he hadn't lain awake at night, straining to hear the quiet arguments his parents had over whether to sell the farm and move. His father didn't share his mother's sentiments. He already had $signs in his eyes. Ben tried hard not to sulk about it. The thought sometimes made a balloon of anger swell in him, and he worried that if it popped, he would yell at his parents and they would ground him. He wouldn't be able to see his friends if that happened, and by the time his dad finally let him out of the house, everyone would be gone. Not Morey. At least, not yet. He flipped through his book, the pages moving so fast that drawings at the edges were animated. He looked over his shoulder, over the heads of his friends where the hills stopped and where the mountains began. Gray, looming, and forbidden. There was so much to do here with his friends, so many things to discover, so many games to create. If they all left, it would be only him by the little river that snaked around Silvercroft to play the annual Grand Tag Tournament. Ash was supposed to be the torchbearer this year, and Ben was the officiator. It was a huge role. Most importantly, he still hadn't found the lost ship. He wanted to lead a grand expedition up into the mountains. It would be their best adventure yet. Juan yelped, dragging Ben's gaze down to them. Ash had his arm twisted back. Juan's face was red and scrunched up in discomfort. Ash was kneeling on his back. He was twice her size and could push her off, but Juan could never hurt anyone, not even when they deserved it, like the McClure brothers. McClown brothers, as Ash liked to call them, who sensed weakness like a shark and mercilessly picked on anyone smaller than them. "Get off me, Ash!" Juan spluttered, trying to angle his red face away from the grass. "Get off me!" Ash sprang up, giggling triumphantly. She sighted Ben watching, and her eyes narrowed. She went round Juan as he struggled to his hands and feet, and came over to Ben. He looked at her with wary eyes. She grinned hugely, her eyes disappearing to slits, and plopped down beside him. He edged away, wondering if she was going to seize his head into a lock. Ash liked playing rough, and she sometimes forgot people could get hurt. She had 3 older brothers and 2 cousins who were Marines. Her father owned a garage where the entire town flocked to with their broken vehicles. She looked up to them all and did her very best to emulate their roughhousing. And then there was Ash's brand of humor, which included playing pranks with slimy worms and spiders and trying her best to spook the life out of people. She was looking down now at Lisa's family packing up, her face uncharacteristically subdued. "We should do something," she declared, her hazel eyes wide and blazing. She was upset. "We can't just let them take our lands." "Technically, it is their land," Nico pointed out, blinking behind his glasses. He closed the book and stuck his pen into his shirt pocket. His face was round, olive-colored, and chubby. His hair was curly and glossy. He resembled the cherubs at the edge of the Valentine card he'd tried to buy this year for Morey. To his dismay, she'd already gotten one from Anthony Stan. Nico continued, "Our parents sold it to them and they signed a contract. They can't change their minds now." Ash scowled at him, but Nico was in a mood to lecture, so he ignored her. "We also can't spook them out of town like you want to do, Ash." Ash stood, folded her arms, and thrust out her chin. "Why not?" Nico blinked up at her. "The adults will find out about our pranks, and we will be in serious trouble." "We will be in serious trouble," Ash mimicked. She kicked at the grass, trying to uproot it with her shoe. "It's stupid! Stupid! I don't want to leave Silvercroft." She flopped down on the grass. "None of us do," Maury said softly. She and Lise had finally ended their long and private discussion. Ben sat upright, suddenly attentive. He turned to look at her. Her face was soft with sadness, and she was holding Lise's hand in hers. Lise's mouth was trembling. "But we really can't do anything," Maury carried on gently. "We could tie ourselves to trees and protest," Ash said, her mouth twitching. She found the idea funny and might just do it because it would amuse her. Suddenly, the humor drained from her face and seemed to curl into herself. "I don't want to leave Silvercroft," Ash repeated in a small voice. She was crouching, her fingers curled around the grass and pulling up blades of grass one after the other, her eyes peering out into the distance. Maury disentangled her hand from Lisa's and stood to go over to Ash. She was 12, the oldest and the tallest of them. Last Christmas, she'd been the same height as Ash and a foot shorter than Ben. It had all changed this year. It started out barely noticeable until the school closed for the summer, and Ben spent 2 days without seeing her. On the third day, he found she was taller than him. This change shocked him, speechless. Ben's mother assumed he was self-conscious about his height, and tried to explain to a red-faced Ben about the changes that occurred with puberty. "Your height will even out in a few years," she tried to assure him. Only Ben wasn't bothered about the height change. He didn't care if Maury was a giant. He only wondered if because he was now shorter, she wouldn't giggle at his jokes the same way she would at Anthony Stan, who was still taller than her. Maury's hair was so black it had a blue sheen, and it was packed about her head in dense curls. Her eyes were a deep brown, like chocolate. When they all first met to form their group, she'd said something to offend Ash, and she snapped and called her Mud Eyes. The name didn't stick, but Ash still used it when she was irritated or as an odd endearment term. The two of them were different as night and day. Maury was tall, lean, and she smiled with her eyes. When she was angry, you also saw it in her gaze, and she looked downright scary. She was also the sensible one. Ash had accused her of trying to mother everyone or play the sensible older sister during most of their games. Even though Ash had been rampaging around the hill for a while, Maury had managed to avoid most of the dirt bombs she lobbed at everyone, and her jean shorts and t-shirt were still pristine. She also had a bow in her hair. On the other hand, Ash was wild, annoying, and her hair was like a tangled mass of loose red curls on her head most of the time. She wore a bandana through it like Rambo, and her green eyes were always sparkling and mischievous. Her fingernails were usually grimy, and she howled when she laughed. It took a while for Ash and Maury to become friends, and even then their personalities clashed a lot. "We will write to each other and call," Maury was saying. "Ben will write a lot, won't you?" She turned her brown eyes on him. Words fled Ben's head, and he found it difficult to speak. There was a tight warmth constricting his throat, and he could hear his heart in his chest. He wiped sweaty palms on his jeans and finally nodded. Maury smiled as bright as the sun and turned back to Ash. "You see, we'll keep in touch." Ben's face grew hot. He'd acted like a complete idiot. Ash shrugged off Maury's consoling arm, but her heart wasn't in it. "It won't be the same. We won't see each other for ages." "We can visit," Lise piped up, her voice lilting at the end. She was the smallest in the group. She had a small, weak chin and wide eyes with eyebrows that made her appear constantly surprised. She looked like a single harsh word would make her cave in. Her hands were gripping the steel handles of her wheelchair, and her eyes were far away and excited, like she was looking into the future and seeing them coming from different cities to see each other. "Yeah," Juan echoed. "We can always come back to Silvercroft to visit and stay at Betty's and race down the streets on our bicycles." "Think about it," Lise urged. Nico frowned. Ben tried to see that future sometime later, all of them reunited in Silvercroft, playing their games as though nothing had changed. Maybe he would be taller, as tall as Anthony, and he'd be able to crack jokes and be a goofball like him. Maybe Maury would hold his hand as they dashed down the streets, running away from Ash's dirt bombs. For some reason, that future seemed like pure fantasy to him. He had a suspicion that the Silvercroft they returned to wouldn't be the same. It would have changed drastically, the corporations leaving their prints all over the town, painting it in their own image. The trees, the lake, the gently rolling farms, they would all be gone. The mountains! Fear gripped his chest. The lost ship! They had to have their grand adventure now. "We can make our last days here fun," Ben blurted out. The others looked at him and he sat up straighter. "We can have the annual grand tournament before we leave, and we can go looking for the lost ship." 5 pairs of eyes stared at him, unblinking.
For only $9.99 a month, you'll get full access when signing up at atail.app, iOS app available in App Store. So click and sign up now. atail.app. Let the adventure surround you.